Okay, I think we are just about at time here, so we'll kick things off as people enter the webinar here. So we'll start with some introductions just while people are joining. So hello everyone, my name is Chris Reddington. I'm a senior manager here at GitHub. I work with a lot of teams from the smallest of startups to established enterprises. And what me and my team do is help share some of these common practices, some of these common ways of working across different organizations. So we write blogs. You may have seen us on the videos for the GitHub social media channels as well, etc., etc. Awesome conferences as well. And I'm delighted today to be building upon some work that we've been doing recently with a white paper that we published on many different strategies to help you with your end-to-end CI/CD governance. So we know it's an important topic because when we think about CI/CD, it's how we bring quality into everything that we do. It's also how we go ahead and scale really our approaches as we build in this cloud world that we're in. So it's going to be a mix of things here today. We're going to be having some slides, some narratives, etc. We've got some polls to walk through with you all as well. And we've got some demos to run through as well. So we've got a good mix of content here for you. Please do type in the chat. I am going to be keeping a watch to see the questions coming in and the discussion, etc. So I would love to really understand a bit about your background, why you're here today, and what you're looking to get from the session. So please do be active in the chat there because that will be very helpful for us here. So where I want to start us first is really just thinking about some of these abbreviations we see on screen here, CI, CD, and thinking about governance. So let's just move along to this introduction here and think about this a little bit. So when we think about continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment, these are trends, these are buzzwords, these are practices that have been around for some time now in the industry from a DevOps perspective. So they're probably not really anything new necessarily. In fact, when you look at some of the reports that have come from companies like McKinsey from about 3 years ago in 2020, what we see is actually really the best performers in the industry, whether that's in terms of building high quality software, whether that's in terms of velocity, whether that's in terms of making sure that there's less friction in the overall process. What we're seeing is those companies that are in the top quartiles of where they're investing in these kinds of processes are the ones that are the most successful. So, in other words, investing in your tooling, investing in automating processes, investing in these practices to help reduce the friction for your engineering teams helps you become one of these high performing organizations. And what it leads to is things like faster time to market. So, being able to ship your software more quickly. It leads to things like increased product innovation because you're not necessarily firefighting anymore against things like whether someone's made a manual mistake in the build process, whether the software isn't up to the quality that you expect it to be, for example. And ultimately, as a result, what that leads to is increased customer satisfaction. Because, of course, as consumers these days, we are not necessarily very forgiving. If my favorite retail application is unavailable to me, if, for example, my favorite game may not be working, I'm probably going to go and look somewhere else. So making sure that we're shipping things with quality, front and center, within everything we do is vitally important for that customer satisfaction there. And actually, when you think about really the overall picture and the state of the industry and where we are right now, what I see from a lot of organizations is maybe a picture which looks something like this. Many, many different tools across the development lifecycle. So when you think about from the planning stages to the coding stage to the build, test, release, monitor, operate, etc., you just see a suite of different tools across that end-to-end kind of life cycle, that end-to-end spectrum. And, it works absolutely, but there's a challenge with that. You have this increased sprawl as a result of using all of those tools. So as an engineer, as a developer, I've got to start looking across all of these different tools to maybe get one job done, to get one task done. So what it means is I'm not necessarily as efficient as I could be. It means that there's that cognitive overhead in terms of getting the job done. Rather than having one single pane of glass and one tool to work with, I've got to work with a multitude of tools. So as a result of that, the operational overhead increases as a result as well. You've suddenly got to maintain a number of different tools at the same time. So there's a number of different challenges when we start bringing many, many different tools into this bigger picture. And of course, what this means is there's potentially some challenges. There's some friction in the overall approach. And what that means from a governance perspective is it's going to be even more challenging because you have to implement those processes, those procedures, those guardrails, whatever you want to call it, whatever your terms are that you use internally. You've got to implement those across those different tools. And there may be limitations in what you can do on one tool versus another. And actually trying to integrate that all together as well into a holistic story, into a holistic picture. So this is why it's really important when we start thinking about the tools that you're using and thinking about governance as well as part of that. Now, of course, at GitHub, we have a solution for that. We use a service, or we have a service, I should say, called GitHub Actions. And I'm just going to bring a quick poll on screen here as we carry on explaining about GitHub Actions and the GitHub platform here. So I'd love to just understand how you're all using GitHub Actions today, whether it's something that you are in fact using in production, whether you may not be as well. Would be very interesting to see that, just know the background here. But when we look at the overall GitHub platform, it's not just about version control, it's not just about open source. There is so much more to the GitHub platform. And of course, repositories is a big part of that, and we'll see some of that as we go through this session today. But of course, we're here today to talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery. So we'll be going through that and taking a look here as we go through. Great, thank you for participating there. So it looks like we've got a good balance actually between folks who are using GitHub Actions in production and those who aren't. I'd love to know, by the way, those who aren't, are you trialing GitHub Actions already today? Are you using another tool for your production deployments? Let me know in the chat. I am taking a look at that, so please do post. Looking forward to seeing that. So GitHub really has this end-to-end platform, as I was just explaining. So GitHub Actions really is a core part of that overall platform. So when we think about continuous integration, continuous delivery or deployment, and really automation more broadly, it's integrated directly into the platform. So you don't have to go to another tool. You don't have to go elsewhere to kind of figure out whether the build has passed or failed, whether the release has been successful, what the results are, etc., etc. You get that information right within the same pane of glass, within that same repository where you're working. So it helps from that productivity perspective, it helps from that efficiency perspective. And because you're overall in that same platform, it means you're able to start standardizing and looking at that from a platform perspective rather than multiple tools. So let's jump in here to some of the different patterns, some of the different themes and ideas that we want to look through here today. And the first one, or first three, I guess, if we want to maybe broaden that out, is all about planning. So these three that you see here aren't really GitHub Actions specific. They're just good general principles to follow when you think about CI/CD, when you think about automation, and when you think about building those processes that are underpinning those business needs, underpinning those business processes, and how you ship your software into production in a way where you're really thinking about governance overall. So really, if we start looking at this from the first block on the left-hand side here, mapping your CI/CD processes and systems from beginning to end. So when we look at organizations, there's of course going to be a great deal of complexity there. You might have to work with numerous different systems, you might have to work with numerous different teams, for example, and there's going to be a number of different challenges that come up along the way. And what you want to do as part of that process is have a real clear understanding of what that value stream map is. So from the point of committing that code, from the point of doing that peer review, for example, what is the essential parts of the process to get you from a review all the way into production? Do you need things like additional peer reviews? Do you need things like checks and balances along the way? And depending upon what industry you're in, depending upon what your background is, what compliance certifications, etc., you might need to go and adhere to, that's going to vary. But that's really the first place to start, is just mapping that value stream out more broadly. And it's something that I've seen a bit of a mixed experiences with organizations, I would say, whether they do that plan or just naturally kind of build out the processes as they go. But having that up front gives you a benefit in terms of being able to see what that existing process looks like. And rather than reinventing the same thing, maybe there are opportunities to optimize. So maybe there are certain things that are done manually today, where actually you could automate those in a certain way. Maybe there's an approach where you can build some governance checks and balances as part of that process that aren't there today to add some more operational rigor to what you're doing. So if we think of an example of, I don't know, shipping a web application, for example, something that is extremely important these days is, and arguably has always been important, but is something where there's an extra amount of visibility on it, is accessibility. And something that I'm seeing as a bit of a trend is more and more organizations bringing accessibility checks into those front end build processes. So that is just one of those examples where if you took that value stream map, say it's your front end website, your brochureware website for your main line of business, you want to make sure that that is accessible for all customers, because if you're not deliberately including people, you could be excluding people. So accessibility as part of that process could be a great example of how you could introduce something new and innovative and optimize that process there. But of course, it's not just about those aspects. It could also be from a governance perspective. So if you think about security as an example, SBOMs, of course, are particularly important, and again, very relevant and topical given what we've seen from the White House over the past couple of years in the US government and mandating this across the industry. So again, there's different aspects that we can start bringing into our workflows, into our pipelines, to go and bring some of that governance and some of that auditability there. And that brings us on to the second box, which is all about defining clear roles and responsibilities for each of the team members involved. Now, again, this is something really interesting because I've seen different patterns, different approaches, and different perspectives across many of the teams that I've worked with. Some will have developers that are also responsible for the CI/CD pipelines within their team. Some will have like a central team that are responsible, like an SRE kind of team who take ownership of the deployment aspects. And there are many other patterns that I've seen as well. But part of that initial process and being able to map that value stream is important because it also helps you understand which systems do you need to work with, but which teams do you need to work with. And it's not just about understanding which teams you work with, but what are the roles and responsibilities within that. So if a build process isn't working for some reason, maybe some tests have failed, maybe a deployment hasn't quite worked correctly, etc., whose responsibility is that to take ownership and investigate that? And if it's your main line of business application, whose role and responsibility is that versus if it's another application which maybe isn't as important? Do those responsibilities differ? Do the roles differ as well? Because inevitably, there's going to be a little bit more criticality, let's say, for that main line of business application. So again, what you want to do is understand the level of access to those underlying systems there and what is needed. So is there some kind of manual process needed to actually go and intervene with some of those systems? Is that all automated? Are there places, for example, where maybe additional permissions might be required by some of those teams? And what are those governance gaps? And more importantly, being aware of where maybe you're giving some additional permissions to teams where you don't need to be. Because again, this is part of this process, is kind of analyzing what you've got today and the opportunity to move forwards and consolidate and work more effectively. And then finally, on the this third box here is about giving teams flexibility, but not too much. And this is a very, very interesting one, because this is probably one of the most common questions that, or discussion topics that I have with a lot of organizations, actually. This idea of empowering your engineering teams versus, let's say, putting guardrails in place, rather than saying no. You need to be able to give people the flexibility that they need to do their jobs, but at the same time, you want to put those guardrails in place so that they are not necessarily going off and inventing things outside of the process, in a way that maybe you haven't considered from an auditability perspective, you haven't considered from an operational rigor perspective, etc. So giving teams the building blocks, giving teams the foundations and the components that they need to be able to build what they need to build is particularly important. So being able to get that balance, and this is some of the things that we'll be talking about here with GitHub Actions. So these three pieces you can see really relate to the planning. Where are we right now? Where are we coming from? And where are we trying to go to? And if we think about that from a GitHub Actions perspective, the beauty of GitHub Actions, as you have seen, if you've used some other CI/CD providers as well, this is kind of where the industry is going, is having this concept of pipelines as code. So being able to declaratively write your pipelines as YAML. So for GitHub Actions workflows, we use YAML. And you can see on screen just an example of that here. What I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to quickly show you an example here of a YAML pipeline, a YAML workflow, and we'll see what that looks like. So I'm just going to move across here into my repository, and I'm just going to spin up this code space because I've got a couple of tricks I just want to show you here, actually. Now you can see in my repository, I've got my folders, I've got my application here, I've got my README. And the way that GitHub Actions work, for those folks who are saying they're not using GitHub Actions today, is in your repository, you have this folder, a .github folder. And within that folder, you've got this workflows folder, and you have a series of YAML files here. And this is where you define effectively those pipelines of work. So whether it's continuous integration, continuous delivery, you can do many other different things as well with GitHub Actions. So it's not just about CI/CD. You can trigger based upon issues. You can trigger based upon comments in an issue. You can trigger based upon a discussion, for example, a board item being updated. So you can be quite clever in terms of the automation that you can go and use with GitHub Actions here. So if I just bring up my code space here, you can see it looks a little bit like Visual Studio Code. And I'm just going to go ahead and open up this GitHub Workflows folder. And we're going to take a look at this build test publish YAML file. Now, don't worry, I'm not expecting everyone to suddenly be experts in this kind of YAML syntax here. But what I want to show you actually is something that I'm using here as an extension. And the extension that I'm using is the GitHub Actions extension. So this came out just a few weeks ago. It's a really, really great extension to help you in terms of authoring, to help you in terms of staying in the flow as you're editing and authoring these workflows here. So you can see as I navigate through, maybe I want to go ahead and delete this line. I'm just going to hit Control Space here. And you can see that it's bringing up this kind of IntelliSense style experience here to go and suggest a number of these different options that maybe I want to trigger based on. So I mentioned we've got things like issue comments, issues, labels, etc., etc. So I can go ahead and be very deliberate about how that workflow is triggered. And this makes it very easy and simple for me to go and author this extension. So I'm just going to undo that. And as we scroll down here, the way that GitHub Actions works is you have a series of different jobs, and each job has a series of things that you can go and do. So you can see this one is just called define build parameters. That's just a friendly name. It runs on Ubuntu. But interestingly, if I go and do control space again, I can, again, get this kind of IntelliSense scenario where it's suggesting to me some of those different options that will be available. So we'll go with Ubuntu latest. And as I scroll down again, I can just keep using this kind of experience. So I can type something like this if here and make it conditional in terms of this one running. I can even look at things like, let's see here. Oops, can never type when people are watching. It's always tricky. And you can see that it's given me this kind of contextual set of properties based upon where I am in the workflow, where I am in what I'm looking at here. So that's the first thing I just wanted to flag is actually, whilst you're going to be using this kind of YAML syntax, you don't have to know it all off by heart. There are tools here to be able to help you do that. Not just in Visual Studio Code, as we just saw there, but also in the GitHub UI. If I go and edit the files here, we can see I've got this different kind of UI on the right-hand side. And if I do this control space again, you can see I've got a similar kind of experience here as well. So that's the YAML aspect. And again, because these workflows are being hosted as code, so they're being stored as code in my GitHub repository, guess what? It gets all the same benefits that the rest of my application code does. It's versioned, there's a history. If we have things like branch protection rules in place, then we can't commit directly to the branch. We need to have a pull request. So we can put all of those great governance features in place, not just for our application code, but also for the workflows as well. So this is why I just wanted to show this little piece here. Good. So let's jump into another quick question here before we start moving on. So let me just stop sharing and open up this next poll here. So I'm just curious, what is the reason that you're with us today and what particularly you're looking to get away from it? So are you looking to identify ways of increasing quality of the software that you ship? Are you trying to look for guardrails in terms of the application teams in your organization? Find out more about GitHub Actions in general, or maybe something else? And I'd, again, love to know in the chat if there's something else that maybe we haven't mentioned there. Please do let us know in the chat. So I can see a little bit of a balance there. So a few folks wanting to find out more about GitHub Actions in general, some who are looking about ways to add guardrails, some looking for increasing quality as well, and a few other answers. So I look forward to seeing the other answers in the chat there. So I'll leave that poll open as we continue on here. So effectively, we just looked at some of the tooling that can help us actually make those workflows and start authoring them. Now, really, the reason why we want to think about these workflows and why we want to think about CI/CD is all about quality, is all about bringing quality into our development lifecycle. So how do we know that we've got a working build? How do we know that all of our tests have passed? How do we know that our security checks have passed, etc., etc.? So hopefully it goes without saying, but one of those things that is still more important than ever is investing time into your automated test requirements, making sure that you are testing the code that you're writing and what you're putting out there. And tests don't necessarily just mean like basic functionality. in terms of unit tests. It could be doing things like fuzzing, API testing, etc., etc. Checking, for example, whether if you call an API endpoint that maybe you've mocked or maybe you've got a smoke test environment out there, what happens if you try and call it without a token, for example? Are you successful? Are you not? And being able to test all of these aspects just as part of the process, as part of your operational aspects in an automated way, makes it more rigorous, makes it more repeatable, and will generally be quicker than myself as a human trying to type the commands, check it out, and carry on. So we're able to bring a lot of that into our workflows. So if I jump back to this example over here, what we'll do is we'll just create a quick commit here. I'm just going to discard that change, and we're just going to go ahead and run some code here. So we're going to create a book search feature in our code. So it's a bookstore application. Book search seems to make sense as some functionality. So we're going to go ahead. We made a change there. And you can see the change that I've made is just adjusting a few lines of code there. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and commit that to my new branch, so my book search branch, because that is a good practice. We shouldn't be directly committing to main. Instead, we should commit to another branch and then do a pull request into main. And we can actually protect against that. This is, again, one of these good governance practices that we can go and do, either using something like branch protection rules or using something called repository rules, which is currently in beta and helps you scale some of those rules more broadly across your organization compared to branch protection rules. So let's commit and push that, and we'll push that to a new branch on the on GitHub itself. So we'll click OK there. And what you'll see in a moment, I get this nice little pop-up. So we'll create the pull request, and we'll just create that as is. And as I jump back to GitHub, you can see here that as I refresh this page, we've got this new pull request which has been created. And of course, in a real world scenario, I would have a much better description for my pull request. And that is something that is really part of that review process. If someone else is reviewing my changes, it gives them a bit of a summary in terms of what has changed there. But within this process now, I have running automatically my build, my tests, code scanning. So, for example, are there new security vulnerabilities that I have introduced into the code base? Dependency review. So, are there potentially issues that have been introduced with new packages that I've brought in? Have I brought in something which has a vulnerability? So all of these things can become just a check as part of the process. And rather than it needing to be an afterthought or needing to be something manually as an intervention, it just becomes an automated step as part of what I do. So you can see here that we've got some code coverage results. If I go and scroll up a bit here, we can see, for example, those code coverage results there. We could easily pull out the test results and output those as a comment here as well. So you can see that I haven't really had to go to another tool. I haven't had to go elsewhere. I'm focused. I'm in my flow. I'm really just focusing on the code that I'm writing, raise that pull request for someone else in my team now to go and review. And we can see that all those checks have passed actually, which looks good, but we're still not able to merge those changes because I still need someone else to go and review those changes, someone else. So I'll need to wait on that change until someone else comes and takes a look at that. Now, that actually takes us very nicely into our next page here and our next set of considerations, really, from a governance perspective. And that is about standardizing all of our practices and protocols for code review and testing. So the one that we just saw on the previous screen there in our pull request flow was this 4 eyes principle. The idea that one person shouldn't be able to write code, initiate the change, build and push directly to production. If that's the case, then hopefully you've got some good automation in there to kind of add some checks and balances along the way. But ideally, you should have at least one other person checking and reviewing and taking a look what's going on there. So effectively, one person should not be able to go from writing the code all the way to production. You should have some additional checks along the way there. It doesn't have to be manually. You could have automation in place to do this. So does the code still build? Does the code pass unit tests, integration tests, security tests? We'll take a look in a moment at even things you can do on the deployment side as well. But ultimately, what you want to try and avoid is having this scenario where you're operating in silos across your organization. You want to try and have some common standards across the organization, some common approaches. Now, there are ways that we can kind of look at that in GitHub, and we'll take a look a little bit later. But from a fundamental level, from a policy level, we want to think about what good looks like across the organization. So we want to almost be policy driven in that approach. So what is the bare minimum that we expect in terms of going into production? Is it that it's built, it's got unit tests, it's had some kind of chaos testing in a smoke environment, for example? And every organization is going to be different based upon their maturity, based upon where they are right now. And this is absolutely a journey. This is absolutely something you're going to be carrying on and changing as you go through this process. But ultimately, what you're looking to do is help your developers as they go through this process really identify proactively where there are issues so that they can make sure that they can fix them before they even get close to production. That is really what this is all about, and bringing these kind of governance practices into place here. So I'd love to know, I'm going to open up another poll here. How are you actually ensuring quality in your company today? What techniques, what strategies, what approaches are you using? So I've listed a few here. We've got branch protection rules, we've got repository rules, which are in beta. We've also got unit testing, for example, in pull request checks. We've also got security checks in pull request checks as well. So again, we'd love to know if there's maybe something else that you're doing. Again, please let me know in the chat. Would love to understand what additional practices you're all using. So let me just take a look here. So it looks like a lot of folks using branch protection rules, which of course has been the main way to prevent someone from directly committing to main. So it's great to see so many folks doing that here. I can see not as many on the repo rules, repository rules. So maybe we'll take a quick passing look at that as we go through, because that's kind of an evolution, I suppose, of branch protection rules. And how you can manage that at scale across your company. Unit testing and PR checks, we've got quite a lot there, folks doing that, which is great. Also a good amount, in fact, the same as unit testing on security checks. So it's great to see that balance there. So good to see that. So that's where we are. We need to think about how we can standardize process at the organization level and standardize what our expectations are. That's what we want to start thinking about. And I mentioned about branch protection rules and repository rules as one way to do this, and we'll take a look at those in a moment. But what are the other things you can do? Because if you think about branch protection rules and repository rules, really all about making sure that your code compiles, it builds, it's tested, etc. And think about it from a code perspective. It's not just about the code aspect, but you also need to think about the environment in which you're deploying into as well. You need to think about, has there been a change since your previous release? And something that is now in beta in GitHub that you may be interested in, you may want to go and explore, is something called environment protection rules. And, deployment protection rules. And These deployment protection rules effectively are similar to branch protection rules, that they're like a check as part of the process, but you're able to interface with external systems. So think about something like Datadog, for example. If you were able to identify whether there has been a drop in the availability, for example, of your application, if there's maybe an increase in the number, maybe in the latency of users being served, for example, something similar, then you could put some rules in place to say, right, stop the deployment, don't let that progress any further. Maybe you've gone into a smoke test environment, for example. So this is something which is fairly new from a GitHub perspective. It's in beta right now, public beta, so I'd encourage you to go and take a look at that as well. But it gives you this ability to conditionally stop the train from releasing, if that makes sense. So if you get to a particular environment and you decide actually it doesn't meet our quality thresholds, maybe it's past all of its builds, its tests, etc., but we get into our staging environment and you know what, it isn't performing as we expect. Clearly there's a regression. We need to go and fix that. This is how you could go and bring that in using GitHub Actions here. So again, definitely encourage you to go and take a look at those. Now, one of the areas I really want to focus on here is some more of the advanced capabilities of GitHub Actions. And we'll go to a bit more of the demo here in just a moment. But there's three main principles that we're going to look at here. The first is practicing least privilege. The second is about secrets and how you can interact with maybe the deployment environments or any kind of third parties maybe that you're interacting with. And the third is around keeping your actions up to date, actually, and how you can make sure that you're using the latest and greatest. So practicing least privilege. The first one that I want to show you here is actually something over in my repository. And if I just jump across to my repo, take a look at Actions General, here we go. So you can see that in my workflow permissions here, I have some permissions that I can set. Now, these permissions, every time that you execute a GitHub action run or a workflow run, that runner, that machine, that agent has a certain set of permissions that it can go and do. It's able to do some things. So it has a GitHub token as part of that execution. And here what we're doing is we're setting what the default permissions are. So whether we want it to be read and write, for example, or whether we want it to just be read instead, so we can control that from a default perspective. We can override that actually in the in our workflow, and this is something we'll look at in just a moment. But you can see in this example over here, we've updated the permissions here and we've set this ID token to write. So again, we'll explain a bit more what that is in just a sec. But like anything, you want to be making sure that you're using the principle of least privilege. So making sure that you're only minting tokens, or rather GitHub Actions is minting tokens, that it only has enough permissions to do what it needs to do, nothing more than that. So if it doesn't need those right permissions, maybe you want to go and change that default to read repository contents as well. So of course, it's always going to vary based upon what you're actually doing in your scenario, what exactly your workflow is and what it is you're trying to achieve. But just keep that in mind, that not only do you want to think about your users' permissions and principles of least privilege, but you also want to think about the permissions of the GitHub Action workflow running. And this is the case for any CI/CD platform as well. You want to make sure you're comfortable with what permissions it has and what it's able to go and actually do and achieve. Now, if we actually build upon that idea and build upon that perspective there, practicing least privilege is one part of that. But we also need to make sure we're looking after our sensitive data, our sensitive information. Now, I don't know about you, but quite often when I'm deploying to my environments, which for me these days is normally the cloud, I need to make sure that I am providing some kind of credentials, some kind of information. So it might be a client ID, it might be a client secret, it might be a certificate, for example, etc., etc. My one fear is I I don't know, I type in my credential, hit submit, and I've just exposed it somewhere in plain text, or I've somehow leaked that credential. Because it's not just as simple as updating that credential once and forgetting about it. I've got to figure out where that credential has been used. I've got to go and update all of the CI/CD systems that use that credential, any other systems that may depend on that, for example, as well. Depending on the scope and how that's been used, it creates a lot of toil for us as engineers. It's not just as simple as easily rotating the password and off we go. So making sure that we can store secrets safely is important. So let me just go ahead here back to my repo and show you a couple of things. So number one is within your repository, you will have this secrets and variables tab underneath your settings tab here. Underneath actions, you can go and specify some secrets. They can either be at the environment level, the repository level, or at the organization level as well. Now, what's interesting is I can actually see that directly within my GitHub Actions extension as well, which is quite nice here as well. So I'm able to go and identify what secrets are there. It looks like I think I might be having some issues on my environment there, but again, there's different ways that I can go and interact with those secrets. But again, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem that I was just talking about, because yes, Chris, you have a secret. It's stored somewhere safe. Like if I go and try and edit that secret, I can't see it. It's kind of write only. I can't read it back. And GitHub Actions will automatically obfuscate that secret as well if it ever gets printed to logs there. But if that got leaked another way, it's still something I'd have to go and update. It's still something I'd have to go and rotate, and that toil still exists. So another approach that we have in GitHub Actions is actually using something called OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is an ability where you can establish a trust between two different platforms. So rather than, let's say, using a password, instead, we manipulate that GitHub token on the runner, on that agent, on that machine. So it knows that it's running in the context of a certain repository. And when it interacts with a resource, like the cloud platform, it exchanges a token for another token. And then I get access to what I need to get access to. So it all sounds a little high level. So let me show you what's going on here. So you can see in my workflow here, what we've got going on is we've just given this workflow a name of login to Azure. I'm using Azure because it's the cloud platform I'm most familiar with. This works with AWS, with GCP, with HashiCloud, and a number of other providers as well. You can implement this yourself as a custom way as well. You can see I've got a couple of different triggers in here. So either any kind of push to the repo or a workflow dispatch. And a workflow dispatch just means a manual click of a button. I've got this permissions ID token write thing. We'll come back to that in a moment. I'll explain what that's doing. We then got our jobs, and I've just created a job called deploy. Deploy is just a friendly name for myself of what I've called this particular runner, this particular machine that it's running on. It's running in an environment called Azure Prod. Again, this is like a friendly name of what I'm calling the environment. It doesn't map to something elsewhere. It's just what I'm calling that environment. It runs on Ubuntu latest, and it has a series of steps. Now, these steps, as we've mentioned before, these are the GitHub Actions. So you can see that this one is an Azure login action. This one is running some kind of CLI command there. Now, if you look at what's interesting about this Azure login step, if I just zoom in a few more clicks here, I'm passing in a client ID, so the ID of some kind of service principal. I'm passing in the tenant ID, so of my identity tenant there, and I'm passing in the subscription ID. So for any of you who may be more familiar with AWS, think of that like an account ID, for example. So what you'll notice is I'm not passing in any kind of property that relates to a secret. There's no kind of password, there's no certificate. I'm just passing in the ID of the service principal, the ID of the tenant, and the ID of the subscription or the environment that we're working within, effectively. So what's going on here? Well, actually, what is happening in line 6 and 7, I mentioned about this idea of permissions and only granting what is really needed. So this line 6 is where I'm starting to override the permissions of that token on the machine. And this ID token write is basically me saying, right, GitHub Actions, you're allowed to go and generate a token to send to an external party to verify and say that you are the GitHub action running in this context. I'm allowing you to go and do that. So what is happening when I run this Azure login step is a token is getting sent to Azure. And that token has some information. Let's say it has the repository name, it has the environment that we're running within, for example, etc., etc. It has a few bits of information. And that token is sent to Microsoft Azure. Now, the beauty then is on the Microsoft Azure side, I'm able to specify in my service principal, in my app registration, if I just open this up, what organization we're allowing to go and use that token, or that service principal, I should say, what repository is allowed, and then we can further restrict it based on like an environment, a branch, pull request, or a tag. So you would have seen earlier that I'm running from Azure-prod. So effectively, Azure will receive that token, look at its kind of manifest and go, okay, that matches, that checks out, that looks good to me. I'm going to generate a token for you, and you get this token back. So we don't have to pass any passwords, any certificates whatsoever. Instead, it's trust-based between the two different platforms there. So let me show you that running in action here. So if we just zoom out a bit here, there we go. And we just go and run that. Let me see, here we go. Run workflow. And you'll see in a moment that this will just run as expected. It's nothing too exciting. All it's going to do is list out the resource groups that I have in my subscription. But what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to change a couple of things. So the first thing that I'll change is the CLI commands that I'm running, because what I'm able to do is based upon the service principal on my cloud provider. So for anyone who's familiar with Azure listening in here, all this app registration or my service principal is able to do is read my subscription. It's not able to create anything, manage anything, delete anything. It's not able to do anything else apart from just read things. So if I navigate back to my workflow, and I go and deploy, or rather change my deploy to go and create a new resource group. So there's just a command line there to create that new resource group. We'll go and commit that change, and we will see once again that this will kick off for us. There we go, because we got those multiple triggers in GitHub Actions. And what we will see this time is that first task, so the login will work, the list will work, but the create will fail, because that token that we receive back from Azure, it doesn't have permissions to go and do that. It's not allowed to go and create resources on Azure as a result. So again, it's a nice seamless experience because I haven't had to use any passwords, any certificates. So there's nothing to leak there from that perspective. I've kept my IDs secret. I've stored them as secrets because that's generally seen as a good practice to go and do. But unless it is this organization, this repository, and this environment of production-Azure, then it won't work. I'm going to show you one more thing just to prove that as well here. So I'm going to edit this. I'm going to comment this back out. There we go. And we're just going to change this environment to be not Azure Prod. And what you'll see happen this time, as we go and allow that to kick off, is that it will fail. The login step will fail. And the reason it will fail is because we don't have a mapping for that not Azure Prod environment. So this is where you can start being very clever about having those different environments, mapping to different permissions, etc. You can see that login step failed. And we're not using passwords, we're not using secrets. So it allows us to start scaling some of those deployment processes without the toil that typically comes with, let's say, passwords, etc. And the final section I want to show you here is automating security and automating, let's say, the GitHub Action versions that you can use. If I navigate across to a repository that I have here, this is a personal side project that I've got going. And you can see in my pull requests, we've got a number of different pull requests which have been raised, not been raised by me. They have been raised by Dependabot. So Dependabot is a service available from GitHub, available for free. And you can go and use it to help you keep up to date with package versions for different package manifest types. So NPM, NuGet, etc., etc. Now, one of those which is available is GitHub Actions. And you can see here that what Dependabot has been doing is bumping the version numbers of the actions that I'm using. Because I don't know if you noticed a bit earlier, but when I'm actually editing one of my actions, workflows, at the end of any action, there is a version number, and that is either a tag on the repository or a Git char that we want to specifically tie to. So what Dependabot is able to do is help us keep up to date in terms of those action steps which are running in our workflows. And the beauty of it being raised as a pull request is the fact that it's a pull request just like anything else. So I can go and verify that everything still builds correctly, everything still runs correctly, and everything looks good to me. So as a result, then I can go ahead, review those changes and say, yeah, we're going to go and merge that. Now, of course, again, I need one approve and review on this. So maybe I would go and approve that, go and accept those changes and merge that then into my main run. But you can see how these kind of advanced capabilities here of GitHub Actions have really helped us in terms of reducing the toil. So thinking about secret management, password management, etc. We also think about principles of least privilege. So only giving access to what is really needed. And then also keeping my GitHub Actions versions up to date. So you can see, for example, this one is being bumped from V1 to V2. So all of these kind of advanced steps are what allows us to start having this very well-governed environment. And then we can get into some really clever aspects then as well. So if I jump back to my workflow over here, and this is always my trivia quiz question. Let me scroll and find it here. Can anyone tell me what is interesting about this particular line here? So you've seen that there are some other steps in here, which are individual GitHub actions. But can anyone tell me what is interesting about this specific line? I'll just give that a moment for folks in the chat. Let me take a look at the chat. Dependency, not, I mean, arguably there's dependency, yes. There's at least one person, I believe, who's able to, there we go. Reusable workflows. Thank you, Adam. Exactly. So it's one of these advanced concepts which is available within GitHub Actions here. So thinking back to where we started and being able to share some of those common practices across the organization, we can shape those building blocks as we need to across the organization. So reusable workflows, think about this end-to-end set of steps here, or think about like a method in an application. So rather than having a sum method which just adds 5 and 8, I can take an X and a Y value and add both of those together and pass in some variables. Reusable workflows are the same kind of idea. You create a template, and then each of your application teams can go and use those set of steps. So when you start thinking about all of the different pieces that we've brought together here, if we start seeing these patterns emerging across the organization, if we start seeing, let's say, common value streams, common dependencies of similar teams, for example, similar platforms that we're relying upon, we could bundle all of those into a reusable workflow. And then what we can do is author those using something like the GitHub Actions extension. We can then make sure they've got the right permissions in place and limiting those from a least privilege perspective. We can use something like OpenID Connect to change what ID tokens are needed, but ultimately we're configuring that on the cloud provider side and giving that inherent trust between the two. And we're centrally in that reusable workflow, making sure that the latest version of those actions are being used and maintained. So we're seeing all of these pieces come together into this reusability, which can then be packaged up and used across the organization. So with that, that is really what I wanted to cover during this session here today with you all folks. So what is next? Think about bringing quality into your workflows. So standardize your practices, start adopting automated testing. That was great to see the number of folks already doing that today. But you can do more. You can do things like security practices. Think about things like those checks and those gates. Lots of you using branch protection rules already today. Take a look, if you haven't already, in your repos at repository rules. So this is this kind of evolution of branch protection rules. And you can even go ahead and set these at the organization level. So you can scale these across your company, which is particularly exciting and particularly cool. So build quality right into everything you do. Scale CI/CD governance. Use platform capabilities like reusable workflows, like we were just talking about, OpenID Connect, and many more. And finally, take a look at some of the resources that we have been publishing as well. So there's a blog post which I wrote, I think, about a month ago. So gh.io/govern-cicd-blog. You can see all the links in there. I'm not going to read them all out, but there's also some docs as well in the tool there for you as well. So with that, if I haven't been able to cover any of the questions that you've had, those seeing the messages of thanks already pop up in the chat. Thank you for your time, appreciate it. Please do click the talk to sales button on the top if you've got any additional questions whatsoever. And of course, please do feel free to connect as well. Would love to see how you continue on with your GitHub Actions journey. But with that, thank you very much, folks. And any questions, please let us know. Thanks.